Hi, it's Nathan here, and today we're talking about excavation and trenching procedures. So these are not a legally required document under the regulations, and they're not an explicitly required document under the ISO standard either, but it is a very common hazard for a lot of our clients in construction. So it's a document that we include as standard in our management systems. In terms of its content, it'll start with how we manage the excavation process in general, with the main hazard being underground services. So things like dial before you dig, service location, non-destructive digging, or like using a vac truck to sort of identify services. We don't just go digging. Then you have access control, so signage and barricades. And then once you have people accessing the trench, it becomes particularly hazardous. So people entering a trench over 1.5 meters becomes high-risk construction work, so you need safe work method statements. In terms of safety controls, you need to ensure they have safe access and egress, including egress, reasonable or accessible egress during an emergency. And then it's benching, battering, and shoring for over any trenching work over 1.5 meters. So a bench is where you build like a bench into it, like right angles, and then each of those benches has to be less than 1.5 meters. A batter is where you basically put a cup, instead of having a vertical wall, you have the wall of the trench at a 45-degree angle or less. And then shoring, which is where you actually install physical, it's called shoring. It's just like a barrier, basically like a cage. It'll steel barriers that'll stop the trench collapsing in on people. Also from an environmental perspective, it is things like dewatering can be important as well. An interesting one that comes up a lot is, are trenches a confined space? And the answer is maybe. It's a firm maybe. It's in the code of practice. It says that trenches and excavations aren't considered. This is in the confined space code of practice. It says that trenches and excavations aren't considered confined spaces by default, but they can be depending on what the hazards are in there. So I'm going to make a video on what is a confined space. But it's essentially, is it an enclosed space? So a trench or an excavation, you would say yes. Was it designed for someone to live in there? And the answer is no, not if this was not designed for someone to live in there. So yes, could be considered a confined space. And then it goes, is it at atmospheric pressure, which is complicated, but let's just skip that one. Go to the next one. And then you look at, are there hazards involved? So things like engulfment, unsafe oxygen levels. There's a few other examples of hazards in there. So if those hazards potentially exist within a trench or an excavation, which in a lot of cases they will, then yes, you could make the argument, or it's an easy argument to make, that trench is now a confined space, which means you're now subject to confined space entry permits and rescue plans and all that goes along with that. And I personally have no problem with this, but it's just one way of looking at it, and it's only one argument, that if you can mitigate those risks or sort of at the design stage or at the management stage, get rid of all of those risks and say, well, no, none of these risks do exist inside that trench, then arguably you can say, well, no, that's no longer a confined space. And it doesn't mean that we can just sort of like willy-nilly go in there and do whatever we want. We still need to manage the risks associated. It's just sort of you dodge the requirement for confined space entry permits and rescue plans and all that goes along with it. But let's say we're going into an excavation. I personally would have no problem with if a subcontractor had dug a trench and they were going to access it. The main risk is trench collapse and having safe access and egress. So if they've got their ladders and battering and benching and shoring, or battering or benching or shoring installed, and things like falling objects are managed, and they've got barricades and fencing, and let's say it's just a clean trench, they've got no generators running in there that could lead to a hazardous environment. Let's say we've got a gas monitor on site, we can drop the gas monitor down there and say, okay, yes, there is, it's safe in terms of oxygen levels, there's no hydrogen sulfide or carbon monoxide in there, or methane. And then also it's not connected potentially to any live services. We're not going to accidentally flood that pit while there's people in there, or that trench while there's people in there. Then personally, I would be happy with assuming all those controls are in place and the supervisor's safe, and ensuring all those controls are in place and the workers are happy and the supervisor's happy. I would personally say that's okay to not treat that as a confined space, but some people would disagree, and it's just basically yeah, technicality, whether you want to treat it as a confined space or not. So yeah, hope that helps. I think that's it. See you next time.